There's a mountain range in the middle of the desert in Arizona that's called the Superstition Mountains. And for decades, adventurers have been going into these mountains to find a secret treasure. But many of those adventurers have died trying to do this, and many more have come right out of those mountains claiming that unseen predators are lurking all around, stalking you as you move through these mountains. And so today's story is going to be about one of those adventurers who goes into them and he comes face to face with something. But before we get into that story, I like it if you like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed today's story. And with that, let's get started. Late in the afternoon of June 14th, 1931, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Adolf Ruth climbed off his donkey that he'd been riding for hours through the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Once he was off the animal, the doctor shook his legs to work out the cramps, and then he just looked at the scenery all around him. And as he did, he smiled. Now, to the average person, what Dr. Ruth was seeing in front of him would look very impressive. There were all these jagged peaks on either side of him that jutted straight up into the sky that almost looked so steep that they couldn't even be climbed. And this mountain range was cut through all over with all these twisting and turning canyons that almost seemed like a maze. Also, high up in these mountains were all these caves where people used to live, but now they were all abandoned. In fact, today, if you were to travel through the Disappearance Mountains, you would go days without seeing another person. And that was true back in 1931, when Dr. Ruth was there. But Dr. Ruth knew where he was standing right now, between two towering walls, was not just a regular desert canyon. The particular stretch of desert was about to make Dr. Ruth a very, very rich man. He was going to be the first person to actually find the Lost Dutchman gold mine, the same Lost Dutchman gold mine that had claimed the lives of hundreds of other treasure seekers who had come into the Superstition Mountains and not come out again. But Dr. Ruth knew he had a special advantage that nobody else had coming here. He had a treasure map, and that was going to show him where the treasure exactly was. And he knew it was right nearby. And without even thinking, he reached into his pack that was slung over his shoulder, and he felt the edges of the treasure map, which was folded up and tucked inside of his notebook. But as Dr. Ruth was daydreaming about finding this treasure, he heard someone grunt from behind him. And suddenly, Dr. Ruth pulled his hand out of his pack, and he whipped his head around. He looked at the two cowboy guides who had brought him out here. Dr. Ruth just said, "What?" In Dr. Ruth's daily life, he was a retired veterinarian and a government employee who worked in Washington, D.C. He was a small guy with glasses, and he walked with a limp. And he knew these two cowboy guides was just thought he was a frail old man. And this deeply offended Dr. Ruth. And so because the doctor totally resented these cowboys, he had told them that, yes, I need your help getting me to a particular spot in the desert, but once I get there, you guys are done. You can leave. I'll pay you and you can just go away. I'll be fine on my own. And as it happened, they had reached this particular spot, and now Dr. Ruth is looking at these guys like, all right, let's go. Get out of here. You don't need to be here anymore. But the cowboys, now that they were at this spot where they were supposed to go back home, they hesitated before they left because they looked at Dr. Ruth and they did think he was a frail old man. And they knew all about how all these people were dying and going into this canyon looking for this treasure. And so the cowboy who had cleared his throat had made a noise to get Dr. Ruth to turn around. And he chimed down and said, "Doctor, I don't know if this is a good idea for you to go in there on your own." And Dr. Ruth, again, is super offended. And he just says to the cowboy, "I'm fine. Just go. I'm going to set up camp. I'm good. Get out of here." And then Dr. Ruth pulled out his wallet. He handed the cowboys some money. The cowboys took the money. They looked at each other. They shrugged. And the cowboys turned around and began galloping away. And as they did, Dr. Ruth was standing there feeling proud of himself for getting rid of these guys. But as they faded into the distance, Dr. Ruth turned back around and he looked at the landscape. And now suddenly, now that he was actually alone, a lot of his bravery was now gone. Now he was feeling maybe a little apprehensive. But Dr. Ruth reminded himself that he knew what he was doing. He was not a frail old man, despite the way he looked. He could handle himself. And he certainly knew this area well. He had a map, he'd be in and out, he'd get that treasure, and then he'd be rich and famous. And so, with that in mind, Dr. Ruth grafted things off the ground. He hopped back on his donkey and he began slowly marching his way deeper into the canyon. A little while later, as the sun was starting to set, Dr. Ruth thought it was time to stop. And so he stopped his donkey and he hopped off. He found a clearing by the side of the trail and he started to set up his campsite. And then finally, once the canvas tent was all set up and his campsite was good to go, Dr. Ruth set a small fire and he then rolled a small boulder in front of that fire and he sat down on it. And then he reached into his pack and he pulled out the notebook. And from inside the notebook, he pulled out the old fragile treasure map. Dr. Ruth's son had acquired this treasure map from a man in Mexico, and this man in Mexico apparently bought it from a family that used to do mining in the Superstition Mountains. They had drawn out this map before. Apparently, were all massacred inside the Superstitions, but somehow or another, their map had been drawn, and where they thought this treasure had survived. And so Dr. Ruth's son had gotten this map and given it to Dr. Ruth. And so Dr. Ruth held the map up and he stared at it for a second. And as he did, he couldn't help but be drawn to this huge rock formation way off in the distance. So not on the map, but actually in real life. Basically far down the canyon, there's just this massive rock formation. And for a second, Dr. Ruth was looking at it, thinking it was just a huge oversized gravestone. And in a way, it freaked him out, but he looked back at the map and he realized there was actually a drawing on this map that clearly represented this big rock formation. And on the map, it had an arrow pointing to this little drawing. And it said this big rock formation was called Weaver's Needle. And according to the map, apparently the treasure was right near Weaver's Needle. And so Dr. Ruth was like, great, tomorrow I'll head straight for Weaver's Needle, I'll find the treasure, and I'll be rich and famous. And on that note, Dr. Ruth folded the map back up, tucked it in his back pocket. But while he was doing that, he whistled periodically to fill the silence that was filling the entire canyon. By the time Dr. Ruth had finished his food, it was already pitch black and silent. And as the doctor was taking in this moment of absolute darkness and silence, he was startled by a sudden sound coming from high up one of the canyon walls. It sounded like hooves marching on stone, and it echoed through the whole canyon. And for a second, Dr. Ruth felt relieved, even though he had been adamant, especially to the two cowboy guides, that he wanted to go into this canyon by himself. Now that he was here by himself, and it's so dark and quiet and spooky, he was glad to hear hooves because it meant that it must be a person riding a horse, and so I'm not alone anymore. But when Dr. Ruth called out and said, "Who's there?" there was no response, and there were no more hoof sounds, and it just went totally quiet again. And suddenly, all he was thinking about were all those stories he had heard about unseen predators lurking in the shadows, stalking people who come into this canyon. And so, Dr. Ruth decided, you know what? I'm just going to go to bed. And so he extinguished his fire, he packed up his things, and he went inside of his tent and laid down inside of his bedroll. And even though he knew he really wasn't any safer in there, all he had was canvas tent material protecting him from the outside world. But mentally, being inside the tent, he just felt safer. And so Dr. Ruth would lay in his tent in the total darkness on edge for a while, wide awake, listening intently for more hoofbeats or something out there. But there were no more sounds. The night remained silent and dark, and eventually Dr. Ruth fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, Dr. Ruth suddenly woke up, and it was totally dark and silent, and he sat up and he looked out of his tent. The flap was open. At first, he couldn't really see anything. It just seemed like darkness out there. But then, he realized moving around very slightly, pretty far away from his tent, but not that far away, were two eyes staring at him, unblinking, just staring directly into his tent. And Dr. Ruth, his heart started to race, and he's realizing that's an animal, a person, something is right there. And so Dr. Ruth, he was about to yell out, when suddenly the eyes blinked and vanished. Dr. Ruth fumbled for his gun, and he threw it, and he aimed out at the tent. And he yelled, I'll shoot if you come back. But there was nothing. Dr. Ruth would stay awake for at least a couple more hours, just anxiously staring out of his tent, wondering if this thing, this person, whatever it was nearby, but He never saw the eyes again, and there were no more sounds outside. And so eventually, Dr. Roof did lay back down inside his bedroll and he went to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, Dr. Roof immediately went outside and began walking out in the direction where he saw those eyes to see if he could, maybe find some tracks in the ground. In his head, he was hoping he would find a bunch of coyote tracks, and that would explain what these eyes were. Even though in the back of his head, he's thinking that didn't look like a coyote. And so, as Dr. Roof began walking in that direction, he did begin to see loads of coyote tracks all over the place. And so he's thinking, there it is, it was a coyote. My brain's just playing tricks on me. But he got maybe 15 or 20 feet away from his tent, and he noticed there was another set of tracks. They were not coyote tracks. They were human tracks, or what appeared to be human tracks, like bare feet tracks. Except the size of them were really small, like a child's foot. Now, Dr. Roof was a really small guy and wore a men's size 6, so he had very small feet. And for a second, Dr. Roof thought, oh, maybe these are my footprints, but he was like, I wasn't over here, and I wasn't walking around barefoot, so whose tracks are these? And then, making it worse, Dr. Roof noticed these little prints, these little human-looking prints. They walked all the way over to the side of his tent, and they appeared to circle his tent over and over again. But then, they didn't wander off and disappear. It's almost like the prints just continued in a circle, and then whatever was making the prints just stopped where it was and vanished. At this point, Dr. Roof was terrified, and he decided, let's just go towards Weaver's Needle. Let's find this treasure and get out of here. And so he rushed back to his tent, he gathered up his things, he hopped back on his donkey, and he began heading towards Weaver's Needle, the thing that looked like the big gravestone. After riding for a couple of hours, Dr. Roof was close enough to this huge formation that he was actually inside of the shadow cast by this Weaver's Needle. And when Dr. Roof consulted his map, he saw that this treasure was supposedly located in the shadow of Weaver's Needle. And so he knew he was close. And so Dr. Roof continued following the map as best he could. He turned its corner behind a rock formation, and then right up ahead, he saw this big wall of cacti that had all these axe heads lost to their flesh. Like someone had taken axe and smacked the axe head in and broken off the handle, but like dozens of times. And so Dr. Roof stopped and he's looking at these cacti, and then he looked at the map and he realized on the map was actually a drawing that resembled these cacti with the axe heads in them. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, this map is accurate. I found another landmark. I must be near the treasure. And so now all he had to do was back up and orient his cacti with the axe heads in it, with Weaver's Needle and its shadow. And if you could just orient it correctly, he knew exactly where to go. After backing up and moving the map a couple of times, he finally had it totally oriented. And he realized there was a path straight up ahead that would go right to the base of Weaver's Needle. And he thought, that's it. That's where I dig. There's the treasure. And so, feeling excited, Dr. Roof hopped off his donkey, he grabbed his pickaxe, and he began moving in the direction of where he was going to dig. But before he got there, he heard something behind him. And when he turned to look, by the time, everything went dark. 10 days later, there was 2 cowboy guys who had brought Dr. Roof into the Superstition Mountains. They came out to check on him to make sure he was okay, and they found his campsite, and it was abandoned, and they searched the entire area all the way down to Weaver's Needle and back, and there was no trace of Dr. Roof. Over the next 45 days, a much larger search party was launched in this area to try to find Dr. Roof, but at the end of those 45 days, there still was no sign of a Dr. Roof, and so the search was called off. And it was assumed that Dr. Roof was dead. 3.5 months after the big search ended, so in December of 1931, another set of explorers were in the Superstition Mountains near Weaver's Needle, the big gravestone-looking rock formation, and they would discover a human skull. It was Dr. Roof's skull, and it had 2 gaping holes in the side of it. A month after that, another set of explorers who were in the Superstition Mountains would find the rest of Dr. Roof's skeleton, located approximately 1 mile away from where his head had been found. But while the discovery of Dr. Roof's body did provide some closure for his family, it actually only deepened the mystery of what the heck is going on in the Superstition Mountains. Because 1, Despite the fact that Dr. Ruth's skull had been found with 2 holes in it, and the fact that his skull was found 1 mile away from the rest of his skeleton, authorities who investigated his death quickly said Dr. Ruth died of natural causes, and they closed the case. And the second weird thing that only deepened the mystery was when they were searching Dr. Ruth's campsite, they would only find his checkbook. And inside of his checkbook, there was all this writing that was clearly from Dr. Ruth writing his checks. And then towards the back of the book, there was a relatively fresh looking message, and the handwriting looked totally different than Dr. Ruth's handwriting. That just said, Vide, viti, viti, which in Latin means I came, I saw, I conquered. Now, we don't know who wrote this message, but the running theory is whoever very likely killed Dr. Ruth wrote this note inside of his checkbook, but we don't know why they wrote this note. Now, eventually, people began to think that because of this note that was in his checkbook, that suggests that maybe Dr. Ruth was on the precipice of actually finding this treasure, and maybe the stories were right about the Superstition Mountains, that something lurks in the canyon protecting this treasure. And when it saw Dr. Ruth was about to take the treasure, this thing killed Dr. Ruth to stop him, i.e., they came, saw, they conquered. Dr. Ruth also, adding to the strangeness of this story, in 1945, so 13 years after Dr. Ruth's skeleton was discovered, an adventurer named Barry Storm published a book about his journey to try to find out what actually happened to Dr. Ruth. And he would say in the book that when he went to the Superstition Mountains, somebody started firing at him from off in the distance, and after taking cover and looking, he couldn't see anybody. And then when he began taking steps further into the canyon to explore where the shots rang out, they came out again. And so Barry Storm ultimately fled to Superstition Mountains, and he would tell people that whoever was out there shooting at him, it seemed like they were shooting warning shots at him. Like, if you come any closer, I'll kill you. To this day, no one has ever actually found any hidden treasure in the Superstition Mountains, but about 9,000 people will go out there looking for treasure every year. And that's a wrap on today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales. Until next time, this is Truth Unveiled, signing off.